700 miles of fractured boundary. 3 centuries and a quarter without movement. 41 ruptures recorded in 10,000 years. 8 million people living above it today. The time between seismic events has already elapsed. This fault is called Cascadia. Most Americans have never heard the name. It is the largest subduction zone in the continental United States. It is the only fault on the continent capable of producing an earthquake above magnitude 9. It runs beneath the Pacific Ocean from Cape Mendocino in Northern California to Vancouver Island in British Columbia. A continuous rupture surface nearly the length of the entire west coast. 2 tectonic plates meet at that boundary. The smaller one, the Juan de Fuca plate, is pressing eastward beneath the North American plate at the speed of a fingernail growing, about 1.5 inches each year. At the contact zone, where the 2 surfaces meet, they are not sliding. They are locked. They have been locked since the winter of 1700. The pressure has been accumulating for 326 years. The crust above the locked surfaces is bent the way a wooden board bends when you press both ends toward each other. The bending has not stopped. Sumatra, 2004, magnitude 9.1. A tsunami crossed the Indian Ocean in hours and killed more than 225,000 people across 14 countries. Japan, 2011, magnitude 9.1. A wave overtook a seawall, 33 feet high. A nuclear plant failed completely. Chile, 1960, magnitude 9.5. The strongest earthquake ever measured by instruments on this planet. The resulting wave reached Hawaii in 15 hours. It reached Japan in 22. Alaska, 1964, magnitude 9.2. The second largest earthquake ever recorded. A coastal village dropped 30 feet in under 4 minutes. All 4 events came from subduction zones. The same class of fault, the same physics. Each one produced a wave that no seawall in any of the affected countries had been designed to stop. Each one was preceded by centuries of silence that geologists later learned to read in the landscape, in buried soils, in sediment cores, in tree rings that had stopped growing all on the same year. In every case, the evidence had been written into the land long before anyone thought to look at it. Cascadia belongs to that same family. There is no American record of the last time it broke. No newspaper account, no government survey, no letter from a settler. In 1986, an American geologist named Brian Atwater walked into a tidal marsh on the Washington coast and noticed something that should not have been there. The marsh sat at the edge of Willapa Bay, behind long ridges of coastal sand. It should have smelled like fresh water. It smelled like the ocean. Atwater carried a shovel and a set of sediment cores. He pushed one into the soft black ground and pulled it back up. The core came out striped. On top, dark living peat. Below it, a thin layer of clean gray sand. Below the sand, a black fibrous soil, dense with the roots of land grasses and small trees. It sat buried several feet down, intact, perfectly preserved, as if a freshwater meadow had been pressed flat beneath wet cement on a single night and sealed there. Atwater pulled cores up and down the coast. Hundreds of cores. The same 3 layers appeared every time. A buried meadow, dropped suddenly beneath sea level. Not gradually, not seasonally, in one motion. There was something else. Throughout the marsh, standing in the salt water with their roots deep in the mud, were the skeletons of cedar trees. Bone white, branches stripped, tall enough to have been mature trees for a century before they died. Their roots sat in ground that had once been dry meadow, well above the tidal zone. They were still standing where they had always stood. They had died there. The picture began to assemble itself. At some point in the recent past, this entire length of coast had dropped several feet in a single motion. The ocean had come in immediately. A wave had laid the gray sand layer across the buried meadow. The cedar trees, suddenly standing in salt water, their roots saturated with brine, had died where they stood. The land had never risen back up. The marsh had closed over them. A slow storm surge could drown a coastal forest across one bad winter. A gradual rise in sea level could do it across decades. But the pattern here was too uniform, too widespread, too sudden. The same buried meadow, the same sand layer, the same dead trees, up and down hundreds of miles of coastline. This was not a local event. The coast had moved all at once. The trees were a calendar. Atwater brought in a tree ring specialist named David Yamaguchi to read them. Yamaguchi cored the outermost rings of the dead cedars in Willapa Bay. He matched their ring patterns against living cedars from the same forest. He matched them against trees at Copalis, against trees at Netarts Bay in Oregon, against trees further inland along the Columbia River. The result was the same everywhere, the outermost ring on every dead cedar. The last ring any of them had ever grown was the growth ring for the year 1699. The trees had been alive through the summer of that year. They had not produced a ring for the year that followed. They had died between the growing season of 1699 and the spring of 1700. All of them, at the same time, across hundreds of miles of coast. The catastrophe had a year. It did not have a month. It did not have a week. A tree ring is 1 year of resolution, and beyond that, the wood holds nothing. Atwater needed a single night, a single hour, a moment when something moved so fast and so completely that the ocean came in and never left. The marsh had no more to give. The trees had given everything they could give. The solution lay situated 4,800 miles across the Pacific. It rested within a fisheries repository along the eastern coast of Honshu, written in classical Japanese script, and it had never been consulted by an American geologist. Nearly 300 years had passed. The archive was not hidden, it was simply never consulted. An unannounced wave reached the Japanese coastline in the spring of 1700, striking without warning. No earthquake had preceded it. No storm had been forecast. The sea rose in the night along a stretch of the Sanriku coast, flooding rice paddies, washing away storehouses, lifting boats from their moorings and carrying them into fields. Village headmen documented the water height, the losses, the timing. They noted that the wave came in cycles over the course of a full day, then withdrew. 3 separate villages recorded the same event in their local chronicles. In Japanese maritime tradition, a tsunami was inseparable from the shaking that produced it. The word itself carried that assumption. A wave with no felt earthquake beneath it was a different category of event entirely. The Japanese had a name for it. They called it an Orphan Tsunami. The orphan of 1700 was unusual precisely because no source ever materialized. No eruption was reported. No tremor reached the coast. The wave had come from somewhere else, and the question of where had gone unasked for nearly 3 centuries. Kenji Satake began asking it in 1996. He was a Japanese seismologist, and he had read the village records carefully. The water height at Miyako, the boats lost at Tanabe, the rice paddies inundated at Kuwagasaki. He entered those figures into a tsunami propagation model, the same kind used today to project where a wave will travel and how much energy it will carry on arrival. Then he ran the model in reverse. He started at the Japanese coastline and worked backward across open water, 4,800 miles of the Pacific Ocean. The model returned one answer. The wave had originated along the Pacific coast of North America. Nothing else fit the arrival times, the heights, and the distribution of flooding across multiple villages separated by hundreds of miles of Japanese coastline. The source earthquake had to have been magnitude 9 or greater. A smaller rupture could not generate a wave with enough energy to survive a full ocean crossing and still carry the force to lift anchored boats at the end of it. The date of the wave at Miyako was the 27th of January, 1700. Satake calculated the travel time across the Pacific at that latitude, roughly 9 hours and 40 minutes. He subtracted that from the documented arrival time. The calculation placed the moment of the earthquake itself at approximately 9 in the evening on the 26th of January, 1700. Local time, on the coast of what is now Washington and Oregon. A winter night, almost certainly raining. That was the hour Atwater had needed, and the marsh could not provide. The cedar trees had been dead for nearly 3 centuries by the time anyone came looking. They had given the year. Yamaguchi's tree rings had narrowed it further, placing the die-off between the growing season of 1699 and the spring that followed. Satake's village ledgers gave the rest. 3 sources, 2 countries, 296 years between the event and its naming. If you watched our San Andreas episode, you already know what a locked fault looks like. Two plates grinding past each other horizontally, accumulating slip year after year. Cascadia is a different class of fault entirely. Here, one plate is not sliding past another. It is diving beneath it, and that difference changes everything about the scale of what is coming. This is how subduction zone earthquakes work, plainly. One slab of oceanic crust slides beneath a slab of continental crust at a low angle. The boundary between them is not smooth. Friction at the contact is high enough to prevent any sliding at all. The plates lock. The oceanic plate does not stop moving. It keeps pushing forward at the same constant rate it always has, about 1.5 inches each year for the Juan de Fuca plate. But at the locked contact zone, that forward motion cannot be expressed as movement, so it goes somewhere else. The continental plate above it bends. It compresses. The leading edge is dragged down and forward by the friction of the locked boundary, while the interior of the continent stays fixed. The plate stores the energy elastically, the way a wooden ruler bends when you press both ends together. The bend is real. It is measurable. Satellites track the surface of the Pacific Northwest moving eastward and downward by fractions of an inch each year. That bending continues for decades, for centuries. Then the lock gives way. It does not give way gradually. The friction holds until it cannot hold, and then the entire locked surface releases at once. The continental plate snaps back toward its unstrained position. The seafloor lurches forward and upward. Tens of feet of displacement in less than a minute. The water column sitting above it goes with it. That displaced water is the tsunami. The wave does not begin at the surface. It begins at the seafloor, and it carries the full depth of the ocean with it as it moves. The longer the lock held, the larger the stored energy. The larger the snap. Cascadia had been locked for at least 500 years before it broke in 1700. 5 centuries of accumulated strain released in roughly 90 seconds. The energy release placed it among the largest subduction zone earthquakes ever produced on this fault system, and among the largest produced anywhere on Earth in the past millennium. 3 independent lines of evidence: a stand of dead trees, a Japanese village ledger, the propagation model of a wave crossing 4,800 miles of ocean, had now converged on one event, one night, one magnitude. But one event is not a pattern. The 1700 rupture could have been the only rupture, a geological accident, a one-time release after an unusually long and unlikely buildup. Was it? The answer would not come from a marsh or a ledger. The third witness came from the bottom of the ocean. Chris Goldfinger is a paleoseismologist at Oregon State University. For more than 30 years, he has been lowering coring equipment off research vessels into the deep Pacific, working the seafloor off the coast of Oregon and Washington. The cores come up the length of a school bus. Each one is striped, layer after layer, pale sediment for the quiet centuries and dark sediment for the violent ones. The dark bands are called turbidites. A turbidite forms when a large earthquake shakes an underwater canyon hard enough to collapse its walls. The sediment from those walls breaks loose and cascades down into the deep basin below. It moves as a cloud suspended in water, heavier particles sinking first, finest silt settling last. The result is a graded layer, coarse at the bottom, fine at the top, sealed beneath the next quiet year's pale sediment. Each dark band is the geological signature of one shaking event, one earthquake, one night. Goldfinger cataloged turbidites from canyons running the full length of the Cascadia margin: Astoria Canyon, Willapa Canyon, the Juan de Fuca Channel, Rogue Canyon, Mendocino. These canyons sit at separate points along the 700-mile fault, separated from each other by open seafloor, draining into isolated basins. They have no hydrological connection. A landslide in one cannot trigger a deposit in another. That isolation was the key. Goldfinger counted only the dark bands that appeared in every canyon simultaneously. A local slide, a storm, a small regional earthquake. Any of these could disturb one canyon. None of them could disturb all the canyons on the same night. The only event large enough to shake every isolated section of seafloor along 700 miles of margin at once was a full margin rupture of the Cascadia Fault itself. Partial ruptures left a different pattern. They showed turbidites in the southern canyons only, or the northern ones only, but not in all of them together. The result, after decades of coring and counting, was a complete rupture record going back 10,000 years. 19 full margin ruptures, 22 additional partial ruptures of the southern section alone, 41 major earthquakes in total, written in mud on the floor of the Pacific Ocean, waiting for someone to read them. The youngest turbidite layer in every core dated to 1700. The same year the cedar trees died in Atwater's Marsh. The same night Sataka's orphan wave crossed the Pacific and arrived at the Japanese coast. 3 independent witnesses, 3 different recording systems, 1 date. The turbidite record also answered the question the marsh could not. One rupture was not a one-off. The fault had been breaking on a repeating cycle across the full span of human civilization in the Pacific Northwest, and long before it. The intervals between full margin ruptures averaged roughly 500 years. The shortest gap in the entire record was around 200 years. The longest was around 700. Somewhere in that range the fault breaks. It has never held for more than 650 years without rupturing somewhere along its length. It has now been 326 years. The Juan de Fuca plate has not stopped moving. It slides eastward at approximately 1.5 inches each year. The same rate it has maintained for millions of years. The same rate it maintained through the entire 326 years of this silence. At the locked contact zone, that motion accumulates. It does not release in small tremors. It does not bleed off gradually. It stores. Since the night of January 26, 1700, the plate has built up roughly 27 feet of unreleased displacement, 27 feet of strain waiting in the rock beneath the Pacific coast. That is more elastic energy than was released in any earthquake of the 20th century anywhere on Earth. There is a 4th witness. Ruth Ludwig is a seismologist at the University of Washington. In the late 1990s, she began collecting oral traditions from coastal native nations along the Pacific Northwest and Northern California coast. The Coast Salish, the Quileute, the Huayat, the Yurok, the Maka, the Haida, the Tolowa. Nations whose ancestors had lived on this coastline for thousands of years before the first European ship anchored offshore. These were not legends about distant heroes or the origins of the world. They were accounts of a specific event, passed down through 10 generations or more, carried in the precise way that coastal peoples carry knowledge of the sea, carefully, with detail, because the sea punishes those who misremember it. Earlier anthropologists had collected many of these stories. They filed them under myth. They were not treated as testimony. They were not compared against geological records. They sat in university archives alongside creation narratives and ceremonial songs, unexamined by the science that was, at that same moment, trying to date an earthquake from tree rings and Japanese fisheries ledgers. Ludwig read them differently. The stories described the same event. A winter night, shaking so prolonged that people could not stand upright. The ocean pulling back from the shore, far back, exposing seabed that no living person had seen exposed. Then the wave, taller than the tree line along the shore. It moved inward across the beach and did not stop. It took the winter houses. It took the canoes. It took entire communities of people sheltering close to the water, as coastal people in winter always do. The Quileute tradition describes canoes returning to shore from open water and finding the village gone. No fire, no sound, no people. The wave had come while the paddlers were at sea. The Huayat tradition, from Vancouver Island, preserves an event at Pachena Bay with enough specificity that researchers have identified the geography. The ocean came up over the spit in the night and carried people away while they slept. The survivors were those who had been sleeping at higher elevation. The community on the low beach did not survive. That account has a name in the tradition. It is a remembered disaster, not an allegory. Ludwig compared genealogical markers within the oral accounts against internal time references. The count placed the events within the same narrow window. The winter of 1700. 4 witnesses now. Each one independent. Each one working in a different format. Wood, paper, mud, memory. Across 2 continents, in dozens of distinct languages spoken by people who had no contact with each other across that distance. None of them could have coordinated the account. All of them recorded the same night. One conclusion follows. Around 9 in the evening on the 26th of January, 1700, A magnitude 9 earthquake ruptured 700 miles of the western edge of North America. The cedar trees recorded it. The village headman in Japan recorded it. The seafloor recorded it. The nations living on the coast recorded it. The record was complete before Brian Atwater pushed his first core into the peat of Willapa Bay. The forgetting was not a failure of evidence. The failure was in who was permitted to be a witness. Speaking of geological systems building pressure in silence, there's a supervolcano beneath Wyoming that has erupted 3 times and left half a continent under ash. It is statistically overdue. We'll get to that. Subscribe and turn on notifications, or just find out about it when the geology becomes relevant. Now back to Cascadia. Because Kenneth Murphy, the man responsible for emergency response across the entire American Pacific coast, summarized what comes next in 8 words. That sentence is what this video closes on. In a Federal Emergency Management Agency planning briefing for the Pacific Northwest, the director of FEMA Region 10 gave a single projected scenario for what happens when Cascadia releases that stored slip. 8 words. Our operating assumption is that everything west of Interstate 5 will be toast. Kenneth Murphy is the director responsible for emergency planning across Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. He did not say this as a warning. He said it as a working assumption, the baseline his agency uses when modeling what comes next. The sentence covers Seattle. It covers Tacoma, Olympia, Portland, Salem, and Eugene. It covers every coastal town in Oregon and every coastal town in Washington, from the Columbia River to the Strait of Juan de Fuca. That is the geography of the sentence. Now consider what produces it. The projected magnitude is 9 or above. Shaking duration at that magnitude runs between 3 and 5 minutes. Standard seismic construction across the United States is engineered for roughly 30 seconds of strong ground motion. 5 minutes is not twice that. 5 minutes is 10 times that. Buildings designed to survive 30 seconds of shaking have not been tested against what comes after the second minute. Most of them will not pass that test. Then the coast drops. Subduction zone ruptures do this. The crust above the break, compressed for centuries by the locked plates beneath it, snaps back. Along the entire 700-mile length of the fault, the land surface drops by 3 to 6 feet. Instantly. What was dry ground becomes intertidal. What was harbor becomes bay. The coastline does not drop in one location. It drops everywhere at once. Then the water comes. Tsunami arrival time at the nearest Oregon and Washington coastal towns is between 15 and 30 minutes. Wave heights depend on the geometry of the bay or inlet receiving the wave. Open coast projections run around 30 feet. Confined inlets and narrow bays focus the water and compress it. In those geometries, modeled wave heights reach 100 feet. 30 feet is a 3-story building. 100 feet is a 10-story office tower. Those numbers are not worst-case estimates. They are the engineering projections used for evacuation planning. 15 minutes is the time available before the water arrives in the closest communities. That is the interval between the end of shaking and the arrival of the first wave, assuming a person can stand, assuming the road is passable, assuming the bridge between the beach and high ground is still standing. After 3 to 5 minutes of shaking in the dark on a winter night, none of those assumptions are guaranteed. The FEMA casualty model projects roughly 13,000 dead. Most of them die in the tsunami, not the shaking. 27,000 more are injured. 1 million people are displaced. The displacement is not temporary in the ordinary sense. Water infrastructure, power, sewage, and the roads connecting the disaster zone to the rest of the country are projected to be offline for between 1 and 3 years, not weeks. Years. Approximately 5,000 buildings inside the combined rupture and tsunami zones were constructed before modern seismic codes. Among them are fire stations, hospitals, and emergency operations centers. The facilities needed to respond to the disaster are among the facilities the disaster will take down first. The ports of Seattle, Tacoma, and Portland are built on artificial fill. Artificial fill liquefies under prolonged ground shaking. The container terminals that handle a third of all American trade with Asia sit on that fill. The single fuel pipeline supplying the entire Pacific Northwest also crosses that fill. There is no alternate pipeline. The Oregon Department of Transportation has estimated that more than 1,000 bridges could become collapsed or impassable in the first hours. Fuel will not move. Supplies will not move. Mutual aid will not move quickly into a region where the roads have been rearranged. Basic services are projected to take between 1 and 3 years to restore across the affected zone. Some coastal communities will not be rebuilt at all. Throughout most of the 1900s, the official geological maps characterized Cascadia as dormant. The fault ran beneath 700 miles of Pacific coastline and produced no written record an American geologist could point to. So it was treated as calm. The Japanese fisheries archive sat untranslated. The dead cedar forest stood unexamined in the tidal marshes. The sediment canyons off the Oregon coast went unsampled for decades. The oral traditions of the coastal nations were collected by anthropologists and filed under mythology rather than testimony. None of it was connected. None of it was heard. The cities grew on top of the silence. Seattle expanded across its hills and filled its tide flats with structural concrete. Portland grew along the Willamette and threaded its infrastructure through the Columbia River Basin. Their combined population reached 4 million. Coastal towns were platted on the low spits of sand between open ocean and sheltered bay, the precise geometry that concentrates a tsunami rather than disperses it. Hospital campuses were built on soft river sediment. Emergency operations centers were sited in the rupture zone. Fuel depots, bridge approaches, water treatment plants, all of it constructed in the decades when the official position was that Cascadia had nothing to say. The Juan de Fuca plate is still sliding eastward into North America at about 1.5 inches each year. At the contact zone, it is locked. Every year that passes adds another 1.5 inches of stored displacement to a total that already exceeds 27 feet. The sediment cores show the fault has never gone more than 650 years without breaking somewhere along its length. It has been 326 years. The cedar trees are still standing in the salt marshes of Willapa Bay and Netarts Bay, bone white, slowly weathering, still rooted in the mud of a meadow that dropped 6 feet on a winter night in 1700. They are the longest-lived eyewitnesses of a catastrophe the country built on top of them and never recorded. How many other ghost forests are standing in other marshes? How many ledgers are sitting in foreign archives in scripts no American geologist has opened? How many oral histories are being carried right now in languages that are not being transcribed? How many dark bands of turbidite are waiting in cores that have not yet been pulled from the seafloor? The 1700 earthquake was not unknown. It was unaddressed. Somewhere beneath the Pacific seafloor off the Oregon coast, 2 slabs of rock that have not moved at their contact since the year 1700 are still not moving. The strain is real. The recurrence interval has already been exceeded. The 4 witnesses have spoken. The rupture is not a possibility. The science is still debating. The question is what will have been remembered by then.